6 tonight as we are continuing through Revelation. The last couple weeks, 2 weeks ago, we looked at Revelation 4 and 5, which was when John was caught up to heaven. And then last week we looked at a passage which was Matthew chapter 24. And the reason why we looked at Matthew chapter 24 is because before we look at the events of the tribulation unfold in detail in Revelation, I wanted you to first hear Jesus speaking about it in a more compact, summary version. Because Jesus, he's the one we should listen to more than anyone, right? And he first gave these end times details to his disciples right before his crucifixion. And last week we read about how in Matthew 24, the disciples were looking at the stones of the temple and just commenting on how amazing everything was. And Jesus just hits them with a bombshell. He says that, not one of these stones is going to stand on each other. And, Jesus was crucified, we can say generally crucified in 33 AD, maybe 30 AD. They get all the dates wrong anymore, but in the 30s AD, Jesus was crucified and rose from the grave. And about 40 years later, the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And so it only took 4 decades for that to be fulfilled. But in Matthew 24, Jesus begins to talk about what will be happening before his return. And what we focused on last week was to point out that this, what is known as the Olivet Discourse, because it's a sermon he preaches on the Mount of Olives, this specifically, the specific audience he is speaking to here, is the nation of Israel. Just as I mentioned last week, when we look at Daniel chapter 9, and we look at the prophecy that Daniel was given of the 490 years that were given to Israel, and we looked at the fact that 483 years of that prophecy has been fulfilled. We had the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the end, which was 49 years. And then at the end of that, we had 434 years until Jesus literally was crucified. Daniel was told that. But then we see that there is a pause because the promises of what would happen after these prophecies have not yet happened because they've not been fulfilled yet, meaning that these promises were when this 490 years is over, that we will have an end to sin, righteousness will reign. And we know that that's not happening right now. People still sin. Jesus is not on earth ruling as he will someday, okay? And so then there is a pause, and that pause was not told to Daniel. It was later revealed to Paul, that pause was the church age. And so the church began at Pentecost, and it will technically end at the rapture. That will be the church age. And so once the church age ends, and the rapture happens, then we're going to get to where the tribulation will start. And I want to be very clear, as I've pointed out, the rapture isn't what starts the tribulation, but the rapture happens before the tribulation. The tribulation, as Daniel says, starts with a peace treaty written by the Antichrist between Israel and her enemies, and it's a 7-year treaty. That's the last 7 years. However, in terms of the rapture, compared to the Antichrist rising and making this peace treaty, I think it could be a pretty fairly short time, okay? Because you're looking at a world in complete mass chaos and confusion due to the disappearance of millions of people, and yet they're going to be looking for answers, and this guy will have the answers, and so they will willingly follow. And today we'll talk about it, but we have already seen examples of that in our common culture. Probably the most one that we can really look at was the whole COVID epidemic, which is that COVID had created so much fear among everyone that many people were willing to listen to all the procedures they have to do, even though there wasn't a lot of science behind some of the stuff behind it. And what really happened was there was a lot of government control that happened because it took advantage of the fears of people, okay? And by the way, this isn't one of those things of COVID isn't real or anything like that. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying is that we did see, though, the active push for government to take control, and they used COVID as the means to do that, to take over. And so we will look at that as we look in Revelation. But we saw, though, that when people are afraid, They are willing to give up their freedoms and give up their whatever to get some sort of comfort, to give it to someone they think is in charge. And this is going to be, COVID times 100, all right? Of people are looking for peace. And this Antichrist brings that. So Jesus talks about this. And in 24, remember, he first talks about the wars and rumors of wars, talks about the famines, earthquakes, and they're but the beginning of birth pains. And I talked about how I believe that we could see that increasing up until the rapture. But I want us to look tonight and look at this, that he's speaking to Israel. And we're going to find that what he says in chapter 24, verses 3 through 12 or 13, we're going to see how it actually correlates very closely to the first seals that he breaks in the tribulation. So in other words, I believe that Jesus is probably talking about the tribulation period, the first 3.5 years, and then the second 3.5 years in his Olivet Discourse, all right? And so I'll explain that as we move on. So in Revelation 6, what's the setting? John is in heaven, and he sees God the Father on the throne, and he sees that in the hand of God the Father there is a scroll, and there's writing on both the inside and outside of the scroll, and that scroll has 7 wax seals on that scroll, as what was customary at that time. To seal a scroll, they would drip wax on it, then they would take their signet ring, which proved it was only that person, because only, whatever king or whatever had that ring. They would press it into the seal, it would harden, and you knew that no one had read that letter unless the wax had been broken off the seal. And so they're holding up this scroll, and in heaven they say, who's worthy to take the scroll? And no one's worthy, okay? No human, no angel, no one is worthy to take this scroll. And John weeps and weeps over it. And while it doesn't specifically say what the scroll is, I believe the context dictates that scroll has to be something basically representing the deed to the earth, okay? It kind of harkens back to Daniel chapter 7, when we see that vision of Daniel sees the throne, and he sees seated on the throne is the Ancient of Days, and he sees one like a son of man approach the throne, and all the kingdoms are given to the Son of Man, okay? And so this is similar to that, where this scroll is here. Who is able to take the scroll? And they say, and John is told, do not weep, because the Lion of Judah is able to take it. And it says, and he said, what reason why? It says because he has conquered. Now, how did he conquer? Well, the next thing we see in verse 6 of chapter 5 is that he sees on the throne among the 4 living creatures, which between the throne and the 4 living creatures among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain. So we see that Jesus is represented by 2 animals right away. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's the lamb that was slain, okay? And it says here, he is handed the throne, and they break into song. And in verse 9 of chapter 5 it says, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you've made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. So what was the price of taking the scroll? It was blood. And the reason why no human being and no angel was able to take the scroll, because no one died for the sins of mankind or anybody else except for Jesus himself. So by his blood, he was able to ransom people for God, okay? And so then they broke down in worship of the Lamb, okay? And so now it takes us to chapter 6, which is that Jesus, holding this scroll now, is going to begin to break open these seals. Now, something I want to point out here is that there was kind of a popular rapture theory that was going on, I would say about a couple decades ago. Remember I told you that people have different visions of the rapture. They think it's either pre-trib, which is before the 7 years, mid-trib, which is 3.5, then we're raptured, then the other 3.5, or they think it's post-trib, where we're raptured at the end of 7 years. There was one more theory that developed more recently, and that was what was called a pre-wrath rapture, which is that some people believe that we would be raptured before the wrath of God came. Okay, and the wrath of God, according to them, happens at the trumpet and bowl judgments, okay? So in other words, when the tribulation starts, they think that we'll be here for maybe the first 1.5 or 2 years and experience the seal judgments. The problem with that theory is because people have said, well, the Bible says that we are not subject to God's wrath, so God will take us out of the earth for his wrath is poured out on us. However, they have said that these seals are not the wrath of God, but rather the attack of Satan. Here's the problem with that theory, is that we see clearly, as we look at these judgments, who is breaking the seal. It's Jesus. And so everything in the tribulation, from the beginning to the end, is instituted and done by Jesus. And so the pre-wrath doesn't hold because the wrath of God begins at the beginning of the tribulation, okay? And so it falls short when you really examine it on that. And I only give that to you in case you ever hear about it. Otherwise, you can just forget about it. But as we get to things, I want to show you. But the main point I want to point out here is that Jesus is in control of every plague and every judgment in Revelation, okay? And we'll get to a point to where God is even praised, saying, yes, you have given them exactly what they deserve, okay? Because some of the stuff's going to be pretty bad, all right? Remember, Jesus said it'll be the worst time in human history, never to be equaled again, all right? So why would we as his church, his bride, why would we as his body go through the worst time in human history, never be repeated again? You know why it's the worst time in human history? Not just the decrepit nature of what humanity is going to be. We're going to see, people die by the billions in this time, all right? And so it's really bad. So then, finally, chapter 6, verse 1. It says, now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, come. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Okay? So the first seal judgment brings forth a rider on a white horse. And notice, what does the rider have? The rider has a bow, and he has a crown. And in looking at some notes and commentaries on this, the crown specifically was associated with the Greek crown of victory, where like if you won an event, you conquered, you received like a crown because you won. So in other words, this guy has basically seen as achieving this crown, okay? And it says he came out conquering and to conquer. Now here's what's interesting. Notice how it says the rider had a bow, okay? But it doesn't say that he had an arrow, and that's intentional. You know, when I put that into AI, originally that guy had an arrow. I said, take out the arrow, all right? And it did. But here's why. Because there's something symbolic about the rider holding a bow without an arrow. Can you do much with a bow without an arrow, right? You really can't. But symbolically what it's saying is that he conquers not through warfare, but he conquers through politics. He conquers through his ideas. Because notice, he rides out on a white horse, and this we know that metaphor, right? The knight in shining armor on the white horse. You know, the good guy rides in on the white horse. And when this guy arrives in this world, he is going to be, to the world, the Savior of the world. Okay? And to the Jews, what he is going to be he's going to be the Messiah. And how does he institute this conquering and to conquer? We don't exactly know, but he's going to be the answer man. He's going to have the answers that no one else in this world has. He's going to be the charismatic leader. You know, if you study history, and I even remember a specific history class that I took in college, over and over and over again, one of the main themes of world empires was that empires and kingdoms were often led by a charismatic leader. They wanted to follow this guy. Whoever it was, the leader inspired them. The leader made the people want to fight for him. Okay? And we understand that now. All right? You look at the political game now. Every election season, they want to make whoever you want to look like. You want to be with that guy. That's the machine. That's how they do that, right? And so then, this guy's going to have all the answers. Everyone's going to love him, and he's going to conquer the world without shooting a bullet. Is really what this is looking at. Okay, he's going to conquer the world without shooting an arrow, and this is what's going to happen. If we were to compare this to Daniel, this is the time when he's able to approach Israel, and he's able to form a peace treaty with the surrounding nations around it, so that they will not be attacked. Now you may say, well, we hear about this all the time. There's always peace treaties with the nations that want to attack Israel and stuff. And yes, we see that. But we know that deep down, there are many Muslim nations that want to wipe Israel off the map. And if they were able to, they would. Yes? Well, basically, it's I can't tell you the exact reason why, because except that it has been how can I say this? It's been a battle they've had since Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac became the father of the Jews after Abraham. Isaac and Ishmael were Abraham's children. Ishmael became the father of the Arab peoples. Now, don't misunderstand me. Arab and Muslim isn't necessarily synonymous. Just because you're Arab doesn't mean you're Muslim. However, many Arabs are Muslims in these nations. Okay, the predominant nations that are Muslims are Arabs that are against them. So you have an ancestral hatred toward each other that goes back from Isaac and Ishmael. Also, what it comes down to is that the religion of Islam is a religion of violence. In other words, they spread the word not by peace, but through the sword. And so they think they are right, and therefore their enemies are the Jews because the Jews think they are right. And so it's almost as easy as that. Think about it. In later on history, you look at the Crusades. What was it? The Catholic Church versus the Muslim nations. And Pope Urban said, hey, if you go fight in the Crusades, you'll go to heaven. That's not true, okay? But he convinced people to do that, and 1095, they went and they took back Jerusalem, all right, from the Muslim peoples. However, it went back and forth, okay? And so here's what's significant about this, is that right now, in Israel today, on the Temple Mount, where the first two temples have been, and it's the only place that they're going to have the temple. Because if you remember, the temple was built on the site where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, and God stopped it and provided a sacrifice. They built their temple there, and they're not going to have their temple anywhere else. It's going to be on Mount Moriah, right where it is on the Temple Mount. Unfortunately today, for the Jews, is that right now on the Temple Mount is basically, I believe it's the third most holy site in Islam, which is the Dome on the Rock, which is a mosque, and it's got a golden dome on top, okay? You can't build a temple where there's a Muslim temple, okay? So what I believe is going to happen here, and I don't know how, all right, so you're not going to hear me say that, but eventually, someday, because we know that there will be a temple again for the Jews, is that somehow the Antichrist is going to be able to have the temple built back on the mount, okay? What that requires then is, it requires the Dome on the Rock to no longer be there, okay? But it's one of the most holy sites in Islam, so how do you do that, right? Somehow, some way, the Antichrist is going to figure this out. And we don't know from now, could there be a war someday in Israel where the mosque gets destroyed? Could there be something? We don't know. But I'm telling you is that Israel wants to rebuild their temple, and it can only be on the mount. And right now there is a mosque. So maybe this happens. Maybe the mosque does get destroyed, and the Muslim nations declare an all-out war on Israel because it got destroyed, right? But then all of a sudden the Antichrist rises up and says, let's have peace. Let's let the Jews build their temple. See what I'm saying? They'll be like, hey, here's the Messiah we wanted. We were going to be attacked on all sides, and he stopped it, and we even get to build our temple. And I think that's going to be kind of the context here. All right? We don't know when the temple will be built, if it's built before the tribulation or not. I kind of think probably during the tribulation it will be. You can build things a lot faster now, than before. It took them 47 years to build the temple last time. Well, that ain't going to happen now, all right? And so, this is a speculation. But we see, though, that the first seal, the beginning of the tribulation, is the arrival of the Antichrist. And he arrives and takes power without even going to war, okay? Any question or comment on the first seal? Yes? That, I believe that, yes. Yeah. And granted, I should point out, we're going to look, these first 4 seals are going to be different colored horses and riders. These are symbols representing real things, okay? So I don't believe the Antichrist is literally going to ride in on a white horse to wherever, but it's symbolizing who he is, okay? And the same thing with these other ones. There are symbols and signs in Revelation which aren't literal, but they mean literal things, okay? And so this symbol of the white horse and the conqueror are literally meaning Antichrist, okay? So then, Antichrist begins to rule. But here's the deal. How do you think Americans would feel if someone out of Europe, because remember, the Bible says that the Antichrist will be of Roman descent. He will be of the descent of the people that destroyed the sanctuary. That was the Romans. I believe that he will also be of Jewish blood, because you couldn't have a Jewish Messiah unless you were Jewish. But you can have a Jewish person be a Roman citizen. Paul was, okay? And so I believe it's going to be a combination of both. We're not given much more detail than that, so I can't tell you like how he'll be associated with Rome or anything like that. But how do you think America would react to someone rising up in Europe and begin to say, hey, everyone is underneath my rule, all right? Americans wouldn't like that too much, all right? Because Americans are like, hey, no, we believe in freedom. We don't live underneath, dictators or emperors or anything like that. And so I do believe that looking at this next seal, this is going to reflect that sentiment in the world where eventually not everybody wants to be ruled by a guy in the other half of the world, okay? And so we look at verse 3, and it says, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come, and out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword, okay? So, these first 4 seals are actually a succession of events that are going to happen. So we see the Antichrist rise up. We see him begin to take power and having people listen to him and do things. Just like, remember, in the COVID area, the entire world were locking down people. The entire world. All had kind of the same idea. And really, that was pretty much insane. All right? Because we didn't really have, the thing is, we had COVID, which was a real disease, causing real problems, but yet the reaction wasn't, let's figure out how we can fight it as much as possible. It was literally, let's do nothing to stop the spread, which never made sense because it still spread. And number 2, you're just delaying what's going to happen. You're not actually stopping anything, and that's exactly what happened. And because of that, for almost a year, senior citizens were prisoners in their own rooms in nursing homes. We were forced to walk down different lanes in a supermarket when it didn't matter. You know, we were forced to wear masks, which weren't really proven to do anything, but it was a symbol of our submission. And by the way, if you want to wear a mask, fine. I don't care. It's America. That's the same. If you want to do it, great. It's freedom. Wear that mask if you want. But the thing was, though, is that we had to stay 6 feet away from each other. Why? They had no proof. There were all these arbitrary rules that made no sense. But yet everybody followed because it was what government told us. And then on top of that, we saw that when people were dying, that if they had any trace of COVID in them, even if they got in a car wreck, they were marked as dying of COVID. And it's true. And why? Because they wanted to bump up the COVID numbers, because the more COVID deaths, the more insanity you could do. It was all meant to keep everybody subjugated. That's what happened. You had people genuinely having COVID, genuinely getting sick and genuinely needing help. All right? I'm not saying COVID wasn't real. There were people that died, people I knew that died of it, people I knew that got very sick from it. However, anytime there was something that could have been something to help, people were mocked about it. All right? Instead of being like, hey, why don't we try it and see if it works? Okay? And anyway, it was delayed and delayed and delayed because people liked the control. And, well, I mean, government did. But we see here then, we see that we're going to see a rebellion. And that's where war comes, is that there's going to be rebellion. Now, what's interesting here is that if we were to look back at Matthew 25, we would see that this kind of resembles what Jesus was saying then, which was, he said, there would be wars and rumors of wars. And that's exactly what's happening here. He says, look at this. He says, verse 5 and 24, I'll just read it. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will lead many astray. That's the first seal. That's the Antichrist. Israel's like, hey, there's a Messiah. Second seal, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. So you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Why would he say the end is not yet? Because the wars are going to be so disastrous, it's going to look like the end. All right? So here's what he's saying. He's saying there's going to be someone saying, I'm the Christ, don't listen to him. And number two, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. Okay? And he says here, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Okay? And so we see that's what begins to happen in Revelation chapter 6, is we see wars and rumors of war. Okay? And so the symbolism here is you've got a bright red rider, which resembles blood. And what is he given? A gigantic sword. What do gigantic swords do? It kills. Okay? So then, any comment on the second seal at all? Okay. Oh, yes, yeah, Tara. Yeah. The one thing the government's agreed on was putting a thumb on population. Yeah. But that shows you really kind of the depth of power. I mean, it shows you why people who have billions of dollars run for office, because they've got everything else. They're like, well, what's even more intoxicating than money? It's power. That's what people want. So then, yeah. If people hadn't listened? Yeah, but as you know, they did. Yeah. You're right. If we all said, no, we're not doing it anymore, it wouldn't have happened. But people don't do that. You know? But yeah, you're right. If we'd all just said, no, I'm not doing that, well, then they couldn't have done anything. But that doesn't happen. And remember, it even came to a point where people, you know why kids are tattletales? Do you know why? Because it's power. They get to get someone in trouble. They get to seem better than others. Well, COVID turned adults into tattletales. Oh, they're outside. They're on the beach. Call the police. I mean, you remember we had rules in Illinois, which was you could only have 2 people in a boat. But yet, if 4 people drove to the beach in a family and they were all in the same car together, once they got out in their canoes, those 4 people couldn't be in the same boat. Only 2 could be. And this is for real. This was asked. This was in a press conference asked. If a person died in a motorcycle accident and had COVID, guess what their death was? COVID. Somehow I guess COVID caused motorcycle crashes. These are real things that happened. It was insanity. It's insanity. We can't believe it. Can't believe it happened, and it did. But in verse 5, and I'm not making any political statement whatsoever. I'm trying to point out the true notion of how power, when they have the foothold, they will do whatever they can to do that. I mean, and this is what the tribulation is going to be. I truly believe COVID was a test run for the tribulation. I truly do. And I believe that many powers in this world learned how to control the world through the successes they learned in COVID. I really believe this. And so anyway, in verse 5 it says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a black horse. And its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. So, what's the next logical step that's going to happen in the world because of these massive wars? Well, you're going to have massive famine. You can't farm crops in wastelands, and you certainly are going to have a lot of things destroyed in terms of food supply, to the point where it says here that if you want a meal, basically a quart of wheat was about enough for a meal, then it's going to cost you a day's pay. That's what a denarius is. You would earn a denarius for a day's work. So think about whatever you earn in a day, and that's what it's going to cost you to get one meal, and that's just for you. That's how scarce food is going to be. Okay? Isn't it interesting how inflation jumped up during COVID? Right? This is what happens. And here's what's interesting too. And scholars kind of differ on this, but it says, and do not harm the oil and wine. Okay? This is all it says, but I heard a comment on this that makes sense to me. And one of them is that some believe that when it says, do not harm the oil and wine, it's more of a commentary on how the poor people or those in the war-torn regions, they're going to be destitute. They're going to be in famine. But those that are rich, they're going to be okay. Because oil and wine were often symbols of rich. You know, it wasn't the poor that had the wine. It was the rich. And oil certainly was used for cooking by everybody. But is this, olive oil? Is it something nicer? I don't know. But here's what I believe here is that you are going to see even a greater divide during this time where the poor are going to be destitute. But the elite, those who had money, those who had government connections, those who had shelters to go to, they're going to be okay. And you may wonder, well, where have we seen this before? Remember during COVID how we used to see celebrities in their mansions? By the way, they can have a mansion, I don't care. But they used to see celebrities in their mansions. While everyone was locked down, they were just in their mansions chilling out by the pool, talking about how nice it was for everything to slow down, talking about how nice it was for the earth to get a rest. They weren't harmed. They didn't lose their job because government wouldn't let them go and do it. You know how many people literally lost their jobs and some never to get that same job back? You know how many people went destitute because they couldn't work and go out there? I mean, the shutdowns was devastating to people. Suicide rates increased. Depression off the charts. It affected whole grades of kids in school who couldn't go back. It was decimating to our society, and quite honestly, we've still not recovered from it. Our food prices are still astronomical. Just for example, it used to be, I'm going to use pop as an example because I like pop. Used to be you could get a 24-pack of Pepsi for $5 to $6, right? Now normally it's 12. How do things become 100% more expensive? How do you double in price? And now that COVID's over, why is Pepsi still so expensive? Because people are buying it for that. Prices don't go down when they know they can get something for it. And yeah. It's total dependence of the governed on the government. It's power. So that's why when you think about it, when you had all the relief, like the tax reliefs, like the whatever those things were called, yes, they were helpful to many people. Yes, but by printing all that money, it made our interest rates skyrocket. We went from 3% mortgage rates to now we're like 7%. Do you know that every time you go up 1% in mortgage, you're paying an extra $100 a month on your mortgage? It's just all of this was a short-term solution that has caused long-term destruction, and it was of all times an election season, and that's what made it even more inflated. Yeah.
When COVID hit,
Mm-hmm.
I felt at least if I wear a mask,
Mm-hmm.
and I stay far away from people, and I get the shot, at least I will have done something.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have to say, from this full disclosure, my husband died of COVID.
And that's terrible. I'm sorry.
Very big thing.
Yes.
very, very serious.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, I'm not downplaying the disease. It was a real disease that had real implications. Yeah.
It's just the schools used to have the dots on the floor, so the kids would stand 6 feet apart. Last year, one of the schools I worked in still had those dots, and they were still.
Really?
Yeah.
I would go in classrooms and there were shower curtains in the classroom dividing the teacher from the students.
Yeah.
I'm just saying is that we went from real precaution to insanity. That's what happened, you know. Just like when we ever have flu season, yeah, we don't cough in people's face, we stay away. If we're sick, we don't come to work. You know, they went beyond, yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 And like I want to point out, when I mentioned COVID, it's in no way mocking anyone or anything like that. It's pointing out ultimately the government control. That's what I'm trying to point out here. You know, yeah, I mean, I did a funeral for someone who died from COVID that I knew, and you know, yes. I don't. And here's why. There was an agenda to make it worse. And the numbers were inflated because of, you inflated the disease to anyone that died with COVID in them, they called it a COVID death. Yeah. And so, yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that I think the government's greatest weapon is fear. Absolutely. And they said, hey, this is worse than anything we've ever had before. Well, for a little bit, we were all thinking that, right? And you're like, wow, this is scary. We thought Ebola came, you know? And, yeah, yes. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. And so, COVID, and by the way, COVID was a terrible disease that evidence has shown now it really was released from a lab in Wuhan, probably made because of a gain-of-function experiment on it that made a virus more powerful. But it was, but that, I mean, I believe all that. So COVID was real, and it got people really sick. There is no doubt about that. So we had a kind of a dual controversy of this releasing of this disease, and then conveniently, government being so ready to shut everything down when it happened, you know. That itself wasn't by happenstance. That was, you know. And so I bring it all back to say that I look at these things here and I'm like, wow, we saw evidence of all this, you know. We saw evidence of the end of cash during COVID. You know, all of a sudden during COVID, no one had any change anymore. Why? Did all the changes disappear? But yet you couldn't get change from anywhere. Part of it was they were saying, well, it's all infected, you can't touch it. Okay? Well, during the tribulation, someday when the Antichrist and the false prophet institute the mark of the beast, where no one can buy or sell without the mark, okay? The only way you can really truly regulate that is to get rid of all cash, to get rid of it all. Now, here's the deal. I'm not against a debit card. I love a debit card. I never carry any money on me. Makes me mad when I can't get something out of a pop machine, right? All right? But you can take nice inventions and use them for bad, just like anybody can. And so you look at this, looks like the poor are going to be destitute and the rich are going to be okay, and you know you just see all these things of how government can control everything, and it's very scary. So, moving on to verse 7, because I do want to get through just chapter 6. So we see now we have Antichrist rises. We have rebellion against Antichrist by nations that don't want to be ruled by him. War breaks out because of that, and death comes. And then because of the war and death, we see massive famine, which will produce more death. Okay? And then we see in verse 7, it says, when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. And behold, I looked, and behold, a pale horse. Now, I saw a note on this which said that in Greek, the color for pale that's mentioned here is kind of the color chlorophyll, like the greenish kind of pale color, okay? It's meant to signify, honestly, like basically the color that a dead body will eventually take, all right? This color is meant for death, okay? And it says here, or when someone, becomes white, it says blood rushes all out of their face, right? You ever seen that? That's real, okay? Anyway, it says, and I looked to behold a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. Basically meaning that people were going to die, and they were, Hades is is basically the abode. It's Sheol. It's where people go when they die, all right? And the majority of them are going to go to hell because that's the majority of people living on earth right now are non-believers, okay? And so it says here, and they were given authority over the earth, death and Hades. So it's symbolic of, just death. And it says, and they were given authority over the earth, they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, okay, the war, with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. As if like the war and famine isn't enough, animals are going to go crazy themselves and just start eating people, okay? It's going to be just a wild land of the lost kind of thing, okay? But notice this, that because of these things, sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. Pestilence, okay, Black Plague wiped out a third of Europe, okay, stuff like that's going to happen again. We see that a fourth of the earth dies. So that means, to make numbers easy, if 8 billion people are on earth like they are right now, that means 2 billion people will have died within the first part of the tribulation period by the fourth seal. Like I've said, we don't know where they're going to die or where it's going to happen. But I believe that as we read Revelation, we're going to notice that everything kind of centers back toward Israel. The birthplace of life was in Mesopotamia, which is the land between the rivers. That's what Mesopotamia means, all right? There's your social studies lesson for the day. And what were the rivers? The Euphrates, the Tigris, okay? Garden of Eden was around there, all right? As the birthplace of all humanity began there, I believe that in the end it's going to end there too. And so I personally believe that our Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, I think that eventually will probably be non-existent in terms of just life. I'm willing to believe that the rebellion will cause mass destruction. And you may say, well, who's going to beat the U.S.? Well, I think the U.S. is going to beat the U.S. due to our moral degradation. I think eventually we're going to eat ourselves alive. That's how the Roman Empire fell. The Roman Empire fell, barbarians took over. Well, how did the barbarians win? Because Rome was in such disarray for everything they did. And so I just think that's what's going to happen. But that's just a speculation, so I could be wrong too. But I do believe, though, that what is not speculation is that the world will be centered again in Israel and in the Middle East, okay? And so then, a fourth of the earth will have died within these first 4 seals, okay? Now, verse 9 is the 5th seal, and verse 9 is going to describe something else that is happening during this plague, death, famine, all this stuff. Oh, before I do that, I want to read you one verse from what Jesus says. Remember how I read earlier that Jesus said, some will say I'm the Christ, don't listen to him. Then he said, you hear of wars, rumors of wars. Well, then he says this, verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines and earthquakes. Seal 3 and seal 4. Okay? And so then you will see that he says here in verse 8, all these are but the beginning of birth pains. Like if you think things are bad now, that, things happen so bad it killed a fourth of the earth. He said, these are just the birth pains. The baby hasn't come yet. Okay? That's what he's saying. And so then, Verse 9 says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. Okay? This altar, it's an altar in heaven. Okay? And we see that under this altar are the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witnesses they have borne. All right. I think these are specific people. They're not the church, because the church has been raptured. The church has been resurrected. The church is in their resurrected bodies in heaven with Christ. Who are these souls under the altar? Well, these are people that became Christians in the tribulation, and they were put to death. You see, they're not raptured yet. They've not been resurrected yet. And so their souls are under the altar here. And it says here, they were slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. So it does say this, and this is a promise in tribulation, which is there will be people who do come to Jesus. And we're going to learn more about that in detail in chapter 7 next week. But in the midst of all this, on top of the disasters of the world, you know what else is going to happen? A consolidation of religion. And the one religion that will not be tolerated is Christianity. And I believe that there will be a widespread condemnation of Christianity and a widespread martyrdom of Christians, where people will kill Christians, Christians will be arrested, Christians will be executed, and we see the proof of that because their souls are there. And here's what they say in verse 10, they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So, those who dwelled on the earth are the ones that took their blood. So these are what theologians or scholars would call tribulation saints. They became saints or Christians during the tribulation. Okay? And they're asking God, when will you avenge us for the blood that they shed? Because remember, the Bible says, do not take vengeance yourself. God says, I will repay. So God promises He will avenge those who have been killed. He will avenge His people. And so they're asking God, when are you going to do it? Because it's getting worse on earth and they're being successful. The Antichrist is succeeding. His kingdom is growing. And it says in verse 11, they were each given a white robe, which represents their sinlessness, their salvation, and told to rest a little longer. Now, isn't that nice so they at least have rest? Because people on the earth don't. And it says, until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So here's what they're told in heaven. They're told, here's a robe, you're safe, be at peace, but there's still a lot more that are going to die and join you before it's all over. That's what it's saying here. And that's what's going to happen, is that there will be many, many more people who will be killed for their faith as they had been. And so they're told to be patient, because someday they will be avenged. And so we'll see that there, on top of all the world disaster going on, there will be a severe persecution of believers to the point of death. All right? This, once again, is why I believe that we are not there, because why would the church be so subject to something like this? What would make the world turn to subject the church to this? Because even though the church, I believe, is getting smaller and smaller all the time, there's still a lot of us still. And there's a lot of people that maybe aren't believers but still side with the church. And so what's going to make a whole world turn against them? Well, I believe the church will be gone, and then they're going to turn against the Christians that start to happen. And finally here in verse 12, and I'll tell you right away, this seal is a little confusing to me, but I'll read it to you. It says here, when he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree sheds its winter fruit, were shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. The kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals of the rich and the powerful and everyone slave and free hid themselves in the caves among the rocks and of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, and for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Now here's why I'm a little confused by this, because what we're reading here is very reminiscent to the end when Jesus returns. Okay? Jesus said that the sun will become dark, the moon will be like blood. Okay? We see here when it says stars of the sky fell to earth. These are basically meteorites hitting the earth. We see that when the sky vanishes like a scroll being rolled up. This is John using his first century knowledge to describe what I believe is a mushroom cloud of a nuclear disaster. Okay? You know, the sky rolls up like a scroll. Well, John doesn't know what a nuclear explosion is. He's using his first century language to say, well, it looks like you're rolling up the sky. Okay? So he's seeing ultimate catastrophe on the earth. It's destroying islands. It's destroying mountains. And when you read the bowl judgments, this is what's going to happen at the end. But what's confusing about it to me is that this is not the end yet. Is that the 6 seals are just the beginning. And so why is the 6th seal so devastating in its nature? All right? Is it showing a preview of the end? I'm not going to say that's impossible to think. Maybe. But we do see that these seal judgments, trumpet judgments, and bowl judgments go in sequential order. So what I believe here is, at the very least is, we are going to see after the end of this war and after the end of this all this catastrophe, there is going to be a worldwide cataclysm that is going to take everybody down to their knees. Okay? And it's described here. And I believe that this happens, and when this cataclysm happens, that will cement the rule of the Antichrist. Because no one is going to have the answers for this except for him. And most of his enemies now are going to be destroyed because of the disaster that came upon the world. And so, you know, we see though, the only confusing thing is that, you know, they say, the day of their wrath has come, who can stand? It sounds like what's going to happen before the day of the Lord when Jesus returns. But at the same time, it confuses me because we know that Jesus is not coming back yet. We've got a lot more stuff to happen here. And so I think it's basically a preview of what's going to ultimately happen when he returns. That we have a world disaster that's going to pave the way for the Antichrist total consolidation of the world. Because he doesn't really become the king of the world until the last 3.5 years. The first 3.5 years is his rise to power. Okay? It's the last 3.5 years where he really is the king of the world until Jesus comes and destroys him. Okay? And so that is the first 6 seals. We're not going to find out what the 7th seal is until we get to chapter 8. Because we're going to see some things in the book of Revelation where we'd equate it to a pause and rewind. Okay? Chapter 7 is a pause. John's like, hey, let's pause for a minute. We're going to rewind back to the beginning of the tribulation. Something else is going to happen alongside of these plagues. Okay? And that's what chapter 7 is. Then we get to chapter 8, and the 7th seal is broken. So technically the deed can be opened, and then other judgments happen. All right? But just to sum up here, like I said, the mentioning of COVID wasn't to really cause any controversy with people and what they believed during that time or whatever. Like I said, I'm a freedom guy. If whatever you wanted to do, fine. That's fine with me. But what I'm trying to point out though is we did see without a doubt what happens when government takes advantage of a disaster. And we've even heard politicians say, never waste a good disaster. Okay? Heard it. Well, because they know. Fear controls people. And when you control people, it makes politics a lot easier. All right? And so, any final questions or anything? Yeah. It'll actually be in the Battle of Megiddo, and that's in Israel. It's a gigantic, flat valley. My wife was there, took a picture of it. Great place for a battle. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay. Sure. Anyone want any vegetables back there, please take them. Yes.
Okay, so when we die, we're going to go to,
Yep.
when Jesus returns to the tribulation, we're coming with him.
Yep. We die and go with Jesus, we come back with him down to earth. Yep. What's that? Then we rule with Jesus on earth for the millennial kingdom.
This will be the end.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we'll get to that in about, 3 months. We're in chapter 6? We got 22 chapters to go. So, all right. Well, let me pray. Well, Lord, as we look at the disasters that are foretold in here, we look at it with humility, knowing that, Lord, of your great power, and how all of this happens because of your power. And Lord, when we look at this, we don't look at it as if we're better, as if somehow we don't deserve this, because in truth, we don't deserve you. We deserve your judgment. But Lord, because of your great mercy, you seek to rescue us from this. And I pray that we'll remember that with everyone else, that, Lord, we study this not to say, wow, glad I'm not going to be there, although that is a comfort. We should study this to know that we have loved ones and people we know that we don't want them to be there either. And so, Lord, I pray that you will empower us, give us the knowledge to know who is willing to hear your word, and give us the courage to be able to speak it to others so they'll believe in you as Lord and Savior. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you.